Oh, you know what happens when I get up here, though? I get very animated. Thank you. Can you hear me better now? Did you get what I said? Because that's the lead-in, right? We want clarity. We want a clear path. We don't, but most of the time we don't get it. But the Transfiguration gives us some help. At least it gave Peter, James, and John some help. So remember, the Transfiguration takes place after they've seen all the miracles. They've seen the signs and wonders that Jesus has performed. They've heard him teach with authority. They know that he's something special, and they have confessed that he's the Messiah. And then he tells them what that messiahship looks like, that he will be handed over, he will be tortured, he'll be killed, and then he'll rise again. And Mark tells us, he says that all quite openly. I love the way Mark says that, quite openly. And Peter says, no way. Do you remember that? And Jesus rebukes Peter. And it's right after that that Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up to the mountain, and they have this experience of Jesus' core identity, the glory of the light of the knowledge of God in the face of Jesus Christ, radiating this divinity. And then, just in case there's any doubt, when Peter sort of says, I don't know what to do, I'll speak instead, something that all hospital visiting chaplains make the mistake of at least once. Anyway, at that point, the cloud descends and they really can't see, and then they hear the voice. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. Listen to him. Peter, James, and John, when Jesus knows that what lies ahead they're going to be dark times, and they're going to have a lot of other voices. And so they need this glimpse, this flash, this unforgettable memory in order to lead them to this destination that they're not clear about and the path that they're not sure of. They need this transfiguration. One of my go-to sources of sage advice is a guy named William Martin. And he says that seeing things differently requires courage. It requires courage, I would say encouragement, that we get from the Transfiguration. Because the voices, the old voices, will kindle those fears that say, there's not enough. You've got to hold on. You'll be all alone. You're going to die. Those old voices have to be suppressed if we are going to see things differently. If Peter, James, and John are going to see things differently, they have to remember that there is enough, that they can trust God, that they'll never be alone. And so to be up there with Moses and Elijah, to hear that voice of God, indicate all of those things. There is enough. There are times, when Elijah, as the prophet we read about in a different reading, felt all alone. In fact, he was ready to throw in the towel. Remember, Bathsheba really had it in for him. Jezebel really had it in for him. And yet, here we hear in this reading that God always provides, that there is always enough of God's attention and grace and mercy to get God's people through. And so while Elijah is passing on, God provides enough in the ministry passed on to Elisha, the passing of the mantle, a double share, in fact, of Elijah's spirit. There is always enough. And we can trust God. Moses is there. Do you remember Moses, the life he had at Pharaoh, or the life apart? But he couldn't hide. He saw that burning bush. And God tasked him with an impossible task. And yet, he could trust God. He did trust God. God did lead Moses in the leading of God's people to freedom. There is enough. We can trust God, and we're not alone. Even when Peter, James, and John, when that cloud descended, the voice came to remind them that they were never going to be alone. To see things differently takes a lot of courage, a lot of encouragement. And so this Feast of the Transfiguration comes for all of us too, in this time as we move from the waiting of Advent and the joy of Christmas and the miracles of Epiphany. But as we turn towards Lent, as we come down from the mountaintop into the valley of the shadow of death, we too need this encouragement so that we can trust that there is enough, that we can let go and let God, that we are never alone. And even death has no dominion over us. That's the journey that we're taking, that we'll begin Wednesday, and we'll follow all the way to that glorious Easter morning. But to see things differently, we need this encouragement, this last booster shot, so that we can be encouraged and live a different way. The apostle that wasn't on the mountain, but who I think of the most in this is Thomas. Not doubting Thomas, inquisitive Thomas. Thomas, who asked Jesus, "Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way?" Remember what Jesus says? "I am the way, the truth, the life." God, Yahweh, is this way, this truth, and this life. Those old voices of the world will tell us that there's not enough, that you got to hold on to whatever you have, that you're going to be all alone in this. So hear that voice. Listen to my son. We're looking for a cleared path, but what we get is instead the way, this way of love, this way of God, where there is always enough, and we can trust it, and we're never alone. I'll give you an image maybe that will help get you kind of down the mountain and through the valley all the way to Easter. It's not my idea. I read it. You read these emails and every day nuggets come out. This is from the Society of St. John the Evangelist. They said that faith is like walking with a candle in the darkness. It's just enough to light just a step or two in front of you. I may prefer one of those Q-beam spotlights, from Boating World, that lights up for it. But that's not what we get. We get a candle. Remember at baptism? From the Christ candle, receive the light of Christ, be the light of Christ in the world. So this Lent, let's give up this need to kind of know exactly and have this clear path. And instead, let's walk by faith rather than by sight. Let's walk with the light of Christ, trusting that just one step at a time, as an individual, as a family, as a church even, just one step at a time. That's all we need to take, with this assurance that there's enough, that we can trust that God is there, that we're never alone.